So pretty much the agreed best way to do the 50 books challenge is to read 4 books a month plus 2 extra books somewhere in there throughout the year. And it's only February, and in January I read 3 books, so I'm already behind. That's exciting, but I don't think it's really going to be a huge problem because I have a lot of reading to do for school and a bunch of books that I'm really excited about reading, so I don't think it's going to be a problem, but it's not the best way to start off the year being already behind. So the first book I read I already talked about in a video. It was Peter Pan, and if you want to watch it you can click right here-ish on my hand and go watch that. The second book I read was called Yes, Chef, and it's by Marcus Samuelsson, who I know because he's occasionally on the Food Network and I think he's really adorable, and so I was like, yeah, of course I'm reading his memoir because he's great. And it was such an interesting book. I'm so glad I read it. Marcus Samuelsson was born in Ethiopia, and his mother died of tuberculosis when he was very small, and he was adopted by a Swedish family and grew up in Sweden. And then he decided, after not being chosen to be on like this football team because he was really good at football, he was just like, alright, I'm gonna go be a chef. And then he spent the rest of his life trying to be a chef. He just has a really interesting life and a really compelling way of talking about his life, and I'm so glad that I read it. It was really, really excellent, and just so many fascinating things happened to him, but I don't want to give them all away so that you can all read it and be surprised, because there was a lot of things that I was really surprised about. It's funny how you think that you have this idea of people in your head, and then you learn more about them, and they turn out to be way more complex than you think, which is typical. I mean, that always happens to me. People always are surprising me because I think I assume that people are a lot simpler than they are very often. So it's always nice to get a little reminder that people are really interesting and that they have interesting stories to tell. I would recommend this book if you're interested in food in general. There's a lot of good food descriptions that made me really hungry throughout it. The restaurant business, there's a lot about the politics of like how a restaurant is run that I didn't really know about, that I thought that was really interesting. He talks a lot about like identity and nationality and how that shapes a person, and that was really interesting. And also there's a lot about New York City, which was cool to read, especially from his perspective, because he has a really unique, I think, perspective on what New York City is like from a food perspective and also just like a personal perspective. The third book I read is called Prospero's Daughter, and it's by Elizabeth Nunez. I read this for a class that I'm taking called Caribbean Women's Literature, which is a great class and I love it, and I've had the professor before and she's really good, but I think it's just a really interesting like subtopic of women's literature to read. Unfortunately, this book was a little disappointing. I liked it at first. It's a retelling of The Tempest, and I think as a storyteller she does some things really well, but also her representations of female characters are sometimes not the best, which was disappointing because I was reading this for a women's literature class, so I was just expecting empowerment and things like that, but this book didn't really give that to me, and so I found myself a little disappointed in it in that way. But if you're interested in reading about the effects of colonialism or like the effects of language on Caribbean people, and you're interested in Shakespeare and The Tempest and those kind of things, it might be a book that you would be interested in. And it's not a terrible book, it just fell short in some ways in my opinion. So those are the 3 books that I read in January, but I've also been working my way through the collected poems of Wallace Stevens for my Modern American Literature class, and I think I might go through and count some of these as books because it's the collected poems, but inside it there are separate collections, and I've read 2 of them in their entirety, and unfortunately I'm not going to read this whole book because I don't really find his poetry that compelling all the time, but I might go through and count the 2 books because they were kind of a struggle to get through for me, so I think I deserve to count them. So maybe I'll do that. I'll see what it says on Goodreads, because Goodreads dictates pretty much how I measure this kind of thing. So if they have them separately on Goodreads, I will put them up like that. But he's not a bad poet. Like, I have no room to say whether or not someone's a bad poet. I'm just not that interested in his style and some of the things that he has to say, and I think he's kind of a boring old fogey. But that's just me. And later we get to read some other boring old fogies that maybe I will like better, such as T.S. Eliot and Robert Frost, so we'll see how that goes. If you have any recommendations on what I should read in February, that would be really great. I have a few things planned and a few things that I'm already working on, so hopefully I will get back on track to do that I would have to read 6 books, I think, which may not be a problem, but we'll see. And I'll update you on what books I read in February soon. Thanks for watching.